Welcome everyone to this channel where I will be sharing episode reviews of that 1960s television show that I enjoy so much, Lost in Space. I encourage you to like and subscribe so that you don't miss each new installment as I work my way through all 83 episodes of this wonderful series. Up next, Season 1, Episode 12, The Raft. Will is conducting shipwrecked sailor experiments, sending small rockets out into space hoping that someone will see one and come to rescue them. Unknowingly, his experiments have consumed all of the Jupiter's fuel. Once getting past his frustration over the loss, John manages to invent a new source of fuel that might prove to be inexhaustible. However, after testing it on the Jupiter 2, it simply doesn't provide enough thrust to get the ship off the ground. Following Will's example, they pull a radioactive chamber from the Jupiter, which should be light enough to send one person back to Earth for help, and Don volunteers for the flight. Smith, however, lays plans to commandeer that capsule and fly it back to Earth himself. As he prepares to lift off, Will enters the small ship and the two of them end up sailing off to who knows where. The Raft is another excellent Season 1 episode. There's some space flight. That space flight once again comes along with some wonderful effects. Will and the always manipulative Smith find themselves on another intriguing adventure. And there's a healthy dose of sci-fi, coupled with some of that ongoing struggle for survival that makes these early episodes a bit extra fun. That said, The Raft is an episode not without its problems, but more on that later. For now, let's get on with our story. Will is preparing to launch another one of his little note-in-a-bottle kind of rockets. The robot, outside the Jupiter, releases a ship and it floats into the sky attached to a balloon which helps the small rocket break free of the planet's gravity. Inside the Jupiter, Penny watches on and we once again have a bit of that needling between this brother and sister, with Will talking down to Penny just a bit. The robot reports out altitudes as the small craft ascends, but for some reason the rocket's engines fail to ignite at the designated time. Will and Penny come out for a closer look, just as John also walks over. At that moment, Will's rocket bursts into flames and begins to fall right towards them all. John grabs the two kids and huddles to the ground, the force field saving all of them at the last minute from this ball of fire. This opening is a fun and exciting scene, but it does prompt a few questions, particularly about the force field. If it was on when the robot released the rocket, how did the rocket pass through during its ascent? It can be argued that the force field prevents invaders from entering while allowing others to leave. If that were the case, though, things that we've seen in earlier episodes no longer make sense, like when the robot specifically had to turn off the force field before heading out to investigate a noise back during There Were Giants in the Earth. Maybe it could be argued that the robot did that so he could get back in upon his return? Maybe it's best just not to think too hard about these things, as we will see the capabilities of this force field change repeatedly over the series. That said, John, Will, and Penny had to dive to the ground before receiving the protection of the force field. Certainly, the dome of the force field must be higher than 4 feet off the ground. But I guess if it was, the scene wouldn't have been as exciting. In the end, once again, it's best to just sort of leave our brains on automatic when it comes to this force field and its capabilities. Upon hearing the explosion, everyone comes out of the ship and John calls an end to Will's experiments. Smith mentions that he'll get back to dictating notes for a book that he's writing on the social psychology of galactic castaways. Of course, the Robinsons and Don are rather skeptical of it. In the next scene, we have Don discovering that the fuel for the Jupiter has somehow become exhausted. Based on past experiences, Don jumps to the conclusion that Smith must be the culprit, and the ensuing confrontation looks like it may actually turn violent, when Will quickly jumps in and acknowledges that maybe he used more fuel than he thought for his shipwrecked sailor experiments. As Don says it,
which makes us galactic castaways forever.
Later, John is working at a device in the lab. Clearly frustrated, he asks Maureen where Will is, and she is quick to say that he shouldn't go on blaming him. He was, after all, just trying to help the family, at which time John acknowledges that neither he nor Don have had much luck of that themselves. Then John turns to Maureen and asks what she knows about the fourth state of matter. She's able to answer, well, with only a little help from John, as he tells her the fourth state is plasma. He launches into a brief scientific explanation, the point of which is that if he and Don succeed, they may possibly come up with an inexhaustible supply of fuel for the Jupiter 2. Before long, John and Don are ready to test this fuel in a small engine in the lab. As the family gathers around, the engine ignites, proving out the concept behind this fuel. Though more testing needs to be done, this leads to quite a bit of optimism that a blast-off is in everyone's near future. John and Maureen begin discussing their destination, and it is agreed that they will carry on towards their original objective, a planet within the Alpha Centauri star system. Meanwhile, inside the Jupiter, we have Smith recording the notes for his book. I love this scene, and it's a wonderful example of Jonathan's skills. As he listens back to his own recording, his faces and his reactions are absolutely priceless, an excellent exhibit of Jonathan's skill as a comedic actor. The clip is about a minute long, and Jonathan himself never actually says a word, and yet I find myself giggling endlessly through the entire scene, including his only actual line, as he compliments himself on his use of the language. It's all very classic Smith.
Splendid, Zachary. Splendid use of the language, as always.
Wrapping up the reel of his notes, he makes it very clear that he has no interest in going anywhere other than back to Earth. A bit later, Don and Judy are having a conversation of their own, Don expressing some uncertainty among all of the optimism, recognizing that this fuel has yet to be tested in the Jupiter's full-sized engines. And Judy offers a few words of encouragement. The next day, everyone is outside the ship as John and Don prepare to test the plasma fuel in the Jupiter. Smith impatiently asks why it's necessary to do such tests. Why don't they just blast off to Earth? John, somewhat sternly, advises him that these tests are indeed necessary, and is equally stern in reminding Smith that their destination is not Earth, but Alpha Centauri. Will asks if they are testing at full power, but John says that this will be a very limited test, or as John describes it,
I'm afraid not, Will. Not enough to lift us higher than the belly of an ant.
Then, John and Don set themselves up behind the ship's controls and begin to power up the engines, both of them excited to hear the engines spring to life. I remember how excited this scene was for me as a kid, that our stranded would-be colonists might finally get back up into space as we see and hear one after another of the Jupiter's engines power up. Things are looking promising until one of the engines responds poorly to more power, leading to an explosion. As the men regroup outside the ship, they recognize that they will not be able to feed the engines enough power to get the Jupiter back up into space. As is so often the case, we have a wonderfully provocative exchange between Smith and Don, Smith being so derisive, while John and Maureen attempt to be the voice of reason.
Some way we can increase the power. What's that supposed to mean?
Your persistence is admirable, Major, but your competence is non-existent.
How would you like a punch in the nose?
I even question your ability to do that.
Now,
just a minute. Hold on now. Dr. Smith, right now morale's very low around here. We don't need any cracks from you to make it worse. If you haven't anything constructive to say, keep your mouth shut. I'm sorry. Perhaps I was just a little subtle for Major West's intelligence.
There was nothing subtle in what you said, Dr. Smith.
Perhaps I'd better explain. I was merely trying to goad him into proving how competent he really is.
Yeah? Well, if that's the way you treat galactic castaways in your book, you'll be the only one who ever reads it.
That remains to be
Then
seen.
Will steps up and suggests that, not unlike his shipwrecked sailor experiments, possibly they can hobble together some smaller space capsule and there would be enough power to get something like that up into space. Don says that Jupiter's reactor chamber might do as a capsule, and he offers to pilot it back to Earth. Here we have yet one more fun little exchange between Don and Smith.
Big enough for one, maybe two.
Oh, two. By all means, two. You and I, Major.
I can't think of a more useless payload than having you along, Dr. Smith.
Are you really?
John and Don have brought the capsule outside the Jupiter and begin to work to cleanse it of its radiation. This is followed by a montage as the Robinsons and Don equip the capsule with all sorts of gear to make it space ready. From behind the rocks, Smith is already hatching a scheme. At first glance, this view of the completed capsule outside the Jupiter could be dismissed as just a matte painting, and certainly the balloon is. However, we can see the Robinsons moving around below, so somehow they were able to merge a matte painting with live action, a pretty cool shot and one that really helps to sell the adventure. John begins describing the flight path to Don, though it seems much of the flight will actually be guided automatically. John goes on to say that they will likely lose communication within the first 30 minutes of the flight. Liftoff is scheduled within 14 hours, and John recommends that Don get as much sleep as possible in that time. Then there's a brief but very sweet scene as Maureen expresses to Don how she recognizes both the importance of his flight to the family as well as the inherent risks he is accepting by taking on this mission.
There may not be time to say very much in the morning, but and I'm not going to embarrass you by saying very much right now, but I do want you to know how we all feel. And until we see you again, you won't be out of our thoughts and our prayers for a moment.
Thanks.
There is also a nice scene with Judy, saying goodbye to Don that evening, as doing so in the morning might have been too difficult for her. Before that, though, we have Smith with the robot. This scene is notable for a couple of reasons. For one, it sets up the story, Smith establishing that the robot knows how to release the capsule and launch it into space. Smith has plans to make off with that ship and establishes with the robot the word cast off as the signal for the robot to release the capsule. But also, we have the robot making a joke at Smith's expense. By the middle of Season 2, the robot deteriorates as a character into someone who essentially does little more than make jokes at Smith's expense. By that time, the robot had already acquired all of his human qualities. Here, during only the 12th episode of the series, the robot is still very robotic, so his making this joke at Smith's expense plays a bit more amusingly than some of what we will see later on. Later that evening, Will comes out of the Jupiter and finds the robot holding the line that keeps the capsule and balloon tethered to the ground. As he walks away, the hatch to the capsule opens and out comes Smith. Will asks what he's doing in there, and Smith invites him in to explain. I always enjoy watching Smith when he's being manipulative. In this instance, he does a good job of getting Will to offer up on his own what he will accept as an explanation.
How'd you get past the robot?
The robot? Ah, yes, the robot. Well, you don't suppose he'd have let me in without raising a fuss if I didn't have permission from Major West?
To do what?
Well, what do you suppose a man in my position would be asked to do?
Well, check on the life support system, I guess.
Precisely, and that's exactly what I was doing when you arrived.
Is everything okay?
In perfect order. One minor check of the reserve atmospheric system, and everything will be ready for cast-off.
You said cast off.
Smith, having uttered the word cast off, leads the robot to release the capsule and it begins to ascend. As the capsule lifts off, I'll have to say I love all the little details that go into making a scene like this so extraordinary. As is so often the case, they are indeed the details. We see the capsule lift off with the door still open and Smith and Will lurching around inside. There's the unusual view out of the porthole looking down on the robot as the capsule ascends. There's also the special effects work, the capsule rising up and eventually breaking away from the balloon as the rockets begin to fire. It is all very convincing. In the morning, John, Maureen, and Don discover that the capsule is missing along with Will and Smith. John actually wonders if maybe Will was shanghaied by Smith. Maureen's maternal instincts come out as quite believable worry over her son. Don says they'd have the same chance of making it back to Earth as he would have had, and John reminds her that Will is thoroughly familiar with the construction of that capsule and they will need to trust him to know what to do. Maureen, like everyone else, just wishes they would radio in so they know he's all right, but by this time, it's assumed that they are already too far out for radio contact. Aboard the capsule, we see Smith dozing off. Will quietly reaches for the radio and begins trying to establish contact with the Jupiter. Unfortunately, Smith awakens and puts an end to that. He declares himself the commander, and he has ordered radio silence. This leads to some testy exchanges between Will and Smith, capped off when an object appears on the radar.
I don't know, but it's coming in awful fast.
Let's get away from it.
If I do that, it'll change our course and we'll never get anywhere.
What do we do now?
I thought you were the commander.
I appoint you first officer. Take over, Mr. Robinson, and I rely on you to get us away from whatever that is on the double.
Before long, the object becomes visible through the viewport. It's a planet. Smith becomes convinced that that planet is actually Earth, and he orders Will to land the capsule. Will takes hold of the controls, fires the retro rockets, and with a small bump, the craft is back down on the ground. Smith is delighted, of course, certain in his own mind that they've just landed back on Earth. He jumps up to exit the capsule, but Will grabs him, reminding him that they don't really know that this is Earth, and if not, whether or not it has a breathable atmosphere until it's been tested. Smith tells him to go on and play with his toys, after which Will declares the atmosphere fine, only further solidifying in Smith's mind that they are indeed back on Earth. Quite reasonably, Will says that if it is Earth, the first thing they should do is try to reach Alpha Control, but Smith prefers a more dramatic approach, that of walking in unannounced. They exit the ship, and Smith delights in breathing in what he calls the sweet fragrance of home. Based on the landscape, he imagines that they are in the Dakotas or maybe Wyoming. He asks Will to pack a lunch for what he expects will be a hike to the nearest hotel. Returning to the capsule to gather some food, Will takes a moment to set the radio to send out an open signal. After trekking through the terrain for hours, Will becomes ever more skeptical that they are back on Earth. He notes that they haven't seen a single bird or even a mosquito, just as they come upon a truly odd sight. The ever-confident Smith dismisses this motionless creature as a skunk cabbage. Will begins to sink as he really starts to miss his family. This brings us to a rather touching scene between Will and Smith.
It isn't space sickness, Doctor.
Then what is it?
Homesickness, I guess.
But this is home.
Suppose it's not. Suppose it's just another unknown planet like the one my parents are on. That means you and I are the only ones here, and we'll have to go on living here forever, maybe. I'll probably live a bit longer than you, because I'm not as old as you are.
Bully for you.
But until then, you're the only person I can rely on. Do you mind?
Do I mind what?
Well, watching out for me, like you were my father. Seeing that I don't get into trouble and that I don't forget to eat or get lost or something.
Do you mean you actually want me to look after you?
I don't have anyone else, Doctor. I'm sure you'd be pretty good at it.
Do you really think so? Of course, I haven't had too much experience with children.
It usually comes natural to a grown-up when there's someone young around.
I suppose it does. I never really thought about it.
Don't.
Don't what?
Think about it. Just sort of roll with the punches.
I understand. If you're tired, I can carry you piggyback.
Thanks, but I guess I can make it on my own.
Good boy, come along.
As the two of them march off together, that skunk cabbage begins to move and slowly starts to follow them both. Before long, Smith and Will find themselves at a dead end. Smith thinks he'll just backtrack and go around, but the opening to this area actually starts to swing close, trapping them both. We then see the skunk cabbage monster on the other side of that passage, and he intends on keeping them both there as prisoners to tend his vegetation for him. Back at the Jupiter, they are receiving the radio signal that Will left open. John tries sending a message, and the capsule is close enough to pick it up. They all make plans to head out to search for Smith and Will, Don with the jetpack, and John and Maureen in the chariot. Meanwhile, Will has been trying to cut through the vines that have them trapped, but they are so tough that they simply dull his knife blade. They consider digging under the vines as maybe the only way to escape. This leads to a fun little exchange between Will and Smith.
You got us into this mess hijacking that spaceship. You start.
Meanwhile, Don, John, and Maureen are on their search. The chariot scene is actually a recycling of the one from Invaders from the Fifth Dimension. When watching this, I always expect to see Maureen point out the alien craft from that episode. Back at the ravine, we have Will discovering that all of their digging has prompted the vines to flower. This leads to an even more fun little exchange between Will and Smith.
We could get out.
Gratitude is not a characteristic of vegetable matter, my boy.
It's a form of life, and even if it can't speak, it knows what's good for it.
I am interested only in what is good for Zachary Smith.
You're telling me.
Indeed.
Slowly, that wall of vines opens up just enough for Will and Smith to get a look at the skunk cabbage monster that has them prisoner. Only now, to his horror, does Smith recognize that they are indeed not back on Earth. The vines ultimately begin to produce fruit. Will surmises that the monster wants them to stay and tend to what is essentially his garden. Will samples the fruit. I guess the lessons learned during the Oasis have already been forgotten. And he even begins to imagine being able to live there for a time. Will's heart and mind remains, though, with his parents, recognizing that all they are probably doing is thinking about him. Meanwhile, John and Don's search has simply not been successful. They now hope to locate the capsule through triangulation, and Don has already taken a measurement of the signal from a remote site, while John does the same from the Jupiter. Back at the ravine, having given some thought to Will's comment about how cultivating the vines has softened them up, Smith begins to pull the vines down, hoping it will open up an opportunity to escape. The creature on the other side, however, has no interest in allowing his two captive gardeners to escape and grabs Smith by the arm. Will tries to help him break free, but during that struggle, to his great surprise, a radio falls out of Smith's pocket. Will picks it up and urgently starts calling out to the Jupiter. Happily, John receives the signal and responds. John says they've located the capsule. Smith and Will try to describe where they went from there. John thinks he understands and heads out to find them. There is yet another amusing little exchange here that leads the monster to release Smith.
What'll probably happen now is, when Don lifts off and heads back to Earth, he'll probably take you with him.
You really think he will?
As his prisoner.
If that's the case, I'd much rather stay here with that bush creature.
Hearing that Smith would rather stay than go with Don, the creature lets him loose. No sooner is he out of the monster's grip does Smith aspire to climb out the other side of the ravine, which prompts the creature to come back in after Smith. Just as the beast closes in on both Will and Smith, John arrives, takes aim, and drops the monster to the ground with his laser. With that, John explains why neither Don nor anyone else is going back to Earth in that capsule.
Don won't have any trouble going back to Earth.
I don't think that Don's going back to Earth.
Why not?
For the same reason you didn't. Not enough power.
You went into an extended orbit around the planet, but you couldn't break free of its gravity.
I knew it all along.
I'll bet.
Finally, we have the scene that sets up our next episode. One of our dogs is missing. John, Don, Will, and the robot are all in the chariot heading out on a mission, which means that the next episode will feature Smith and the ladies alone to safeguard the Jupiter campsite. I find this episode to be a very fun one, but as always, will withhold my comments until reviewing that next episode. So a few more thoughts on the Raft. I enjoy this one quite a lot, but it is unquestionably a step down from such spectacular adventures as The Derelict or Island in the Sky. Inasmuch as it is a very fun ride, there are some pretty substantial gaps in logic, or at least things that are a little too hard to believe even for this enthusiastic 6-year-old little boy. Maybe most prominent among them is this new fuel. The Robinsons have been stranded on a distant, unknown planet for some time. Will has exhausted their fuel, and in that moment, John invents an entirely new type of fuel based on the concept of the fourth state of matter that he himself says he's not sure he understands, and they instantly have the tools and methods necessary to produce it right on board the ship, and even adapt their engines for its use, and they're already testing it in the Jupiter just a day or so later? These are all things that are necessary to tell the story that's being told. It's all pretty cool stuff and very fun to watch. It's also easy to get caught up in John's excitement for the prospect, but it's also just a bit too hard to believe. The same could be said about the construction of the small lightweight craft assembled out of components from the Jupiter. Here too, it's a lot of fun to watch, but that capsule sure seems to come together very quickly and rather simply. Who knew rocket building was so easy? Amusingly, early in Season 3, we are to discover that they already have a capsule aboard the ship in the form of the space pod. But we'll obviously have to forgive that one. There's also the matter of the capsule's radiation. It's all a bit laughable as Don goes in to spray the radiation away with a fogger, while John stands right by the door not wearing any protective gear at all. But that's all right, because before very long, we'll have Will examining radioactive rocks with his bare hands, so I guess we'll need to forgive this one too. When the capsule first launches, it's very cool how we look down on the robot as it ascends into the sky. However, that's not the way the porthole is oriented. I guess we can assume there was a porthole in the floor that we never actually got to see. A bigger problem, though, is with the capsule's spaceflight. That, as John tells us at the end, they were in an extended orbit and never broke free of the planet's orbit. But if that's the case, how is it that Will fails to realize that that planet never left his field of view, or even the radar screen? And since the Jupiter, too, took them light years from Earth, how can even Smith possibly believe they made it back to Earth in hardly any time at all in this small makeshift capsule? It also doesn't make sense how quickly John and Don are able to find Will and Smith after locating the capsule. At one point on their trek, Will tells Smith that they've been walking for hours by the time they come to be trapped in the ravine. However, when Will and John establish radio contact, John seems to be able to dash over to the ravine in mere minutes. I guess we can assume Smith had to make a million stops, maybe to rest his feet or remove sand and rocks from his shoes as he does so often throughout the series, but once again, a little bit of a stretch here. There's one last thing that bothers me that is so small I hesitate to even mention it, but it does always attract my attention each time I view this episode. It is said, probably correctly, that the writing on Lost in Space was often clunky, that it lacked subtlety. One particular exhibit of this is when Will and Smith are aboard the tethered capsule. Smith, speaking to Will, inadvertently utters the word cast off, and the robot pulls the cord, declaring, "You said cast off," which was the agreed upon signal for launch. It's the robot's statement, or really, the tone of his statement. To me, it almost has a na-na-na-na-na quality to it. I know Smith said cast off, I just heard him. It seems unnecessary to have the robot announce that to Smith in the way that he did it. At most, maybe the robot could have just repeated cast off as he pulled the cord. I know this is only one line and a seemingly tiny thing, but for me, it's one of those sort of moments that I very much wish was handled a bit differently. That is quite a list of head scratchers, and you'd think it might add up to a poor ranking for this episode. For me, however, the Raft actually remains very enjoyable, and there are a great many reasons why. One is the prospect of hope. It's exciting to see our space pioneers starting up and testing the Jupiter's engines, and how that further feeds the possibility of getting back up into space. There is hope that Major West may make a successful flight back to Earth and arrange for a rescue mission. There's all the planning and preparing, the danger, the sentimental exchanges between Don and Maureen, as well as Don and Judy. And then there is the anticipation of Don's launch in the morning. It's very easy to find ourselves caught up in everyone's excitement. This episode features a very human story, and it is well written and acted by all. And here I might as well add that this is yet another very good ensemble cast episode. We are also treated to a lot of individual fun moments, like Smith's dialogue as he plots to abscond with the capsule, and then later as he fools Will before they inadvertently take off. It is Smith in his manipulative and conniving glory. And speaking of Smith, I so do delight in that scene when Smith is listening back to his notes on his books. It is, for me and my tastes, so fantastically funny, but it is comedy played not to detract from the episode, but to contribute to it. The effects in this episode are all wonderful. The wider shots of the capsule and balloon on the ground, the effects of the raft flying and pulling away from the balloon. It's all very convincing. I always find a lot of enjoyment in the little details that are easy to overlook, but show extra attention by the director, and they all make a difference. For instance, it's great how the raft capsule does not land perfectly level, but a bit askew. And that is even something that is shown inside the capsule as well as outside. We even have a small callback to the genesis of the series when Smith says they should see some signs of civilization before long since Earth is suffering a population explosion. Finally, we have the ongoing evolution of the Smith-Will relationship. During one of my first reviews, I mentioned how this relationship would blossom over time, but that it was not a straight line. It lurches back and forth a bit as they gradually sort out what their relationship was to become. We see some of that here during the Raft, especially in contrast to our prior episode. During Wish Upon a Star, Will and Smith clearly had grown a relationship. Smith very much valued Will's esteem and friendship, and Will simply liked Smith and enjoyed having him as a friend. In the Raft, Smith clearly still values Will's friendship, and Will clearly still sees Smith as a friend. There are very sweet scenes like the one during which Will asks Smith to look after him like a father. At the same time, though, Smith clearly places his own interests far above Will's and is at times quite dismissive, if not even nasty to him. At the same time, Will clearly remains skeptical and even critical of Smith. I always laugh at that one exchange, Smith saying that he's only interested in what's good for Zachary Smith, and Will dismissively responding, "You're telling me." This amply displays that though Will does consider Smith to be a friend, he understands exactly who he is. In another exchange, rather tersely, Will tells Smith to take the first shift digging them out. A later Smith would have kept offering excuses until he somehow gets out of the work. This early version of Smith, though, valuing Will's friendship and somewhat acknowledging that he is responsible for the spot they are in, actually gets down on one knee and begins digging. All of this is in contrast to other more warm and friendly exchanges between the two of them, even in this episode. In the end, even though he does know exactly who he is, Will simply likes him. This episode stands out as a fun moment in the evolution of that relationship, dancing between trust and distrust, skepticism and affection, all on its way to becoming a more solid and trusting friendship, one that will essentially come to define the series over time. So how do I rank The Raft? As I said at the beginning, this is definitely not a top-tier episode like some of the first 5. But for my taste, it's also much more fun than The Oasis. So for me, I grade this episode as an A- and rank it 19th for the season. I also rank it 34th for the series, comfortably in the top half of all episodes, but not quite up into the top third, and for me, that sounds just about right. So with that, let me give the last word to our emerging jokester, the robot.
I take it that you're thoroughly familiar with what is necessary to release that bag of wind out there.
Thoroughly familiar with bag of wind right here.
Do you mean me?
Affirmative.
Very funny.
If you would like to see the full Lost in Space series, at the time of this recording, it presently airs for free on METV. That said, you can still find the full series on DVD at Walmart for a very reasonable price. Better still, pick up Lost in Space on Blu-ray. On that set, there are some wonderful extras, including commentary by the cast. Like I said, I'm a fan, so for me, the Blu-ray is a must-have. I hope you enjoyed my thoughts on this episode, The Raft. One of the things I enjoy most about sharing reviews like this is how different fans perceive each episode quite differently, and I invite you to leave your own perspectives below in the comments. Most of all, I hope you will come back to join me when I review our next episode, One of Our Dogs is Missing, another very fun Season 1 episode. Once again, I recommend subscribing so that you don't miss each new installment of this series. Thanks for watching.